Welcome to our reflections for today. This week we enter into the Passion story, and what we discover is the way in which the events surrounding Jesus' final days gather space and intensity. Things begin to happen rather rapidly and quickly. And what the gospel writers are doing is telling the story in ways that invite us to find our own place within the narrative of the Passion and the Crucifixion. Where do we find ourselves in this horrific story? Which of the key characters in the Passion story do we feel drawn to and why? So the goal of reading the Passion story is not for us to be passive bystanders as we read, although that too is reflected in the story. And if that is the position or the posture we choose to take, then to reflect on why this is. The goal is to enter into the story and so be affected by the story or the event. So as I read the Passion story this week, I find myself drawn particularly to the character of Judas Iscariot. A lot has been said about Judas, but I am drawn in particular in the different ways in which the four gospel writers reflect on Judas's place in the gospel account. I want to do this in two parts, beginning with this first part, which I have called Judas, Object of Curiosity. Judas, of course, first appears in the Gospels in the calling of the 12 apostles by Jesus. And here is Matthew's account. These are the names of the 12 apostles. Then Matthew lists for us the names of the apostles. And then eventually he gets to this. And Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. And so it is fair to say that Judas Iscariot has not had it easy in history. He stands alone as a tragic figure with his deeds attached to his name as a lesson to all posterity. And in our Western imagination, Judas has become a potent and powerful symbol of an enigmatic villain, the arch-traitor or betrayer and evil. Indeed, as one theologian has put it, Judas has not been a marginal figure in Christendom. He presents us with a central human and Christian problem: how to deal with the enemy and foreigner, and our understanding of evil. But Judas is slowly changing his image. Some say that our negative image of Judas must go, not necessarily because of Da Vinci Code and its sensationalist claims of conspiracies and cover-ups by the church, although that too has contributed to our changing perception of Judas today. Rather, part of the argument is that Judas has long been used by the church and in our Western society as a perfect scapegoat. And as a result, we have unloaded on him our anger and insecurity, often harassing and killing Jews in place of Judas, to free ourselves of collective guilt. Thus, on the road to Western anti-Semitism, Judas came to stand for the Jews as Christ killers. We might find that that is a very difficult and hard critique for us to hear. But there are some truth in that critique. We need to wrestle with in the ways Judas has come to be used both historically and theologically, and in our social imagination as a symbol of evil, and the effects and the implications of such construction in social relations. Another reason for Judas's changing image is the way in which critical scholars are reading or rereading the Gospels away from the traditional approach and critically placing Judas's role in the first century context and background. So, for example, some critical scholars have come to the conclusion that in the first century context, what Judas did would have been seen as an act rather similar to what we would today call an informer or a whistleblower. You might want to think, for example, of whistleblowers in recent memories, such as Edward Snowden, whistleblowers in the police, or in the NHS or in other corporate organizations. More on this later in the second part. But for now, who really was this man? This Judas Iscariot, who stands behind this powerful and damning image in our Western imagination. Image given to us by poets, by playwrights, by preachers, theologians, and novelists. As we heard earlier from Matthew's account, our Gospels all say that he was chosen by Jesus as one of his close apostles, although they don't quite say how he came to be chosen. And that he did bear the full name Judas Iscariot. But what is in this name? Some say that Iscariot is a compound name, is a place name, meaning man of Karoith. Ish, name for man, Karoith, a name for a place. The precise location of this place, however, is not known. But the suggestion is that Judas, unlike the other disciples, came from Judea, not Galilee. And as a Judean, he possibly had an upper class background. All this meant that he was the odd one out and felt alienated from the disciples and Jesus himself, who all shared Galilean outlook. It's very interesting to reflect on that sometimes when we read the gospel, especially the apostles, we can get this picture of a very cozy, rosy group that get on or get along so well. But actually, when we read carefully, we do get a sense of unrest and sometimes tensions within the group. Think of the story where the James, the son of Zebedee, come to Jesus and actually says, when you come to your kingdom, let me sit on your right hand. And the other disciples being incensed by that. But the idea is that Judas rather became ambitious for high status in the kingdom of God. But when he found that Jesus had no desire for political power, he became disillusioned and, for now I use the word in inverted commas, betrayed him. But another suggestion is that Iscariot, the name Iscariot, means dagger man, from Latin sicarius. And that this word was associated with the members of the Zealot movement, who were active opponents of the Roman occupation of Judea and engaged in acts of armed resistance. You might want to think of the Zealots perhaps rather today as the far right group. So in this view, Judas had a warlike career as a zealot before entering Jesus' band of apostles. Judas Iscariot means Judas the Zealot. Interestingly, Judas was not the only zealot chosen by Jesus. When you read the Gospels account very carefully of the calling of the apostles, you notice that the lists of the apostles also include one called Simon the Zealot. Matthew doesn't use the phrase, but he used the phrase Simon the Cananian, but the other gospel writers do use the phrase Simon the Zealot. And that he and Judas Iscariot are always listed together at the bottom of the list of Jesus' apostles. Some Jewish scholars tend to favor this position, the idea that Judas was a zealot, and in fact, or indeed, Jesus himself may have been a zealot. In fact, some, as I just mentioned, describe Jesus himself as a zealot. So the Jewish scholar Agyam Maccabee, the eminent Jewish scholar, argues in his book Judas Iscariot and the Myth of Jewish Evil. He argues that if we see Judas as a zealot, then, and I quote, a shift of thinking may therefore become necessary regarding Jesus himself and his aims in claiming the messiahship. A movement that recruited a high proportion of its leaders from the zealots would seem likely to have had more in common with that movement than orthodox thinking allows. So this argument is very much predicated on the assumption that Judas Iscariot was a zealot, and to some extent Jesus himself and the disciples were zealot movement, sort of a version of the zealot movement. If you could argue otherwise, or if you could show otherwise, which most scholars are likely to do, then the argument suffers somewhat. In recent years, however, there has been a shift away from focusing on the name Iscariot to the name Judas. Not much has been made of it. We've tended to focus quite a lot on Iscariot, but now some scholars are focusing a little bit on Judas as a clue to understanding the place of Judas in the Gospels account. The name Judas, of course, was a common name associated with the great patriarch Judah in the Old Testament. Judas is the Greek translation of the name Judah. And my sense is that it is likely that when Jewish Christians first heard the story about Judas, they would have made connections straight away with the story of Judah and his active role in the selling of Joseph. In Genesis 37, we hear the story of how Judah and his brothers sold Joseph to the Egyptians. What is interesting to note is that the selling of Joseph also occurred during eating or meal time. And the parallel with Jesus sharing meal at the Passover night with his disciples before he was handed over or to use our common phrase translation, betrayed by Judas to the authorities, is easy to spot. So just as Judah and his brothers were eating when they decided to sell their brother Joseph, so Jesus during a mealtime expressed strong feeling that there was enough unhappiness among the apostles or the disciples about his mission, and that one of them would certainly communicate his concerns or intentions to the authorities in charge. So if Judas is here being made to stand for Judah, and the story of the selling of Joseph is a possible background to Judas's role in the passion, then we hear an echo of a shameful story of jealousy and betrayal of a family member, or in this case, a close friend. And so one of the questions at least, that we might want to ponder in this respect is this: how do we live in community, whether in church, work, or in family, without our personal ambitions and jealousy fracturing and destroying us? And maybe too, our enchantment with Judas goes much deeper. That our image of Judas is mainly a reflection and projection of ourselves. Perhaps we see in Judas what each and every one of us is capable: the sin of envy, rivalry, jealousy, disappointed dreams, and disillusionment, stretched to the absolute limit, with our backs against the wall, with our reputations and our dreams and aspirations on the line. We are all capable of the act of Judas. And that impact may explain why we are both horrified by Judas and at the same time enchanted by him. In that case, perhaps we need to take this wise counsel from the Talmud to heart. Pay attention to your thought, because they become words. Pay attention to your words, because they become actions. Pay attention to your actions, because they become habit. Pay attention to your habit, because they become your character. Pay attention to your character, because it is your fate. In the second part, we shall reflect on how the four gospel writers each tries to understand Judas's motive. So welcome back to our second part on our reflections on Judas Iscariot. So I begin in this second part with a short reading from Mark's account, just 2 verses in fact. Mark 14, verses 43 to 46 and 46. Then Judas, one of the 12, appeared, and with him a crowd, with swords and clubs from the high priest. They lay hands on him and captured him. All our Gospels, our 4 Gospels, to some degree share a basic storyline about the betrayal. in the Last Supper and in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus revealed that he is to be betrayed. He expresses alarm at the fate of this person who is going to carry out this act, but ultimately gives the signal to Judas to carry his mission, to go to the high priest and hand him over. Judas goes to the religious authorities to tell them of Jesus' whereabouts, an act for which he accepts payment of 30 pieces of silver. In the garden, Judas kisses Jesus so that the arresting party may know where he is and instruct them to arrest Jesus, bind him tight, and take him away. Later, when Judas learned that Jesus has been handed over by the high priest to Pontius Pilate, the Roman official in charge, he returns to the temple and, in anguish born of remorse, proclaims that he has made a mistake. When the high priests refused to take back the 30 pieces of silver, Judas throws them back into the temple and then hangs himself. Or, according to Luke, in Acts 2, falls forward on the ground and his body bursts open, pouring out his entrails in an ignominious death. And that is the point where we come in, quite naturally and curiously, with our question. Why did Judas betray Jesus? Why did he do it? Now, if we read each of the Gospels carefully, we discover that each Gospel writer attributes different motive to Judas. Mark's Gospel, which we just heard, is our earliest written Gospel. And it is interesting that in Mark's account, we have no motive. Mark gives no explicit motive for Judas's act. Mark simply says that Judas handed over Jesus. And hold on to that phrase, handed over, because we'll come to that later on. Judas simply handed over Jesus to the authorities. When you get to Matthew's account, Matthew's Gospel, Matthew puts Judas's motive down purely to greed. Judas, says Matthew, was motivated by material gains, by money. And that's very interesting, really, because recall how the theme of money and material concerns and possession plays an important part in Matthew's Gospel as a whole. When we turn to Luke, Luke, on the other hand, attributes Judas's motive to Satan himself. For as he put it, then Satan entered Judas, called Iscariot, one of the 12. Luke 22, verse 47. And again in Luke's Gospel, Satan has been actively pursuing Jesus from the very beginning. He tried him at his temptation, and now, right at the very end of Jesus' ministry, Satan returns. And this time, he uses Judas as his vessel to do his dirty trick or work on Jesus. And as for John, the author of the fourth Gospel, Judas was a thieving devil, the son of Satan, whom Jesus knew from the very beginning to be on the side of evil. So different motives as to why Judas did what he did. Most scholars today would say that Mark's gospel, where no explicit motive is given for Judas's act, is the original, and that those given by Matthew, Luke, and John are later development, later in extrapolations. So originally, no motive was attributed to Judas, other than that he handed over Jesus to the religious leaders. But then as the story got told over and over, think of the Chinese whisper, people, as is often the case, gradually looked for motive. And by the time John's Gospel was written by the end of the first century world, the search for motive for Judas was complete. As one theologian has put it, when early Christians told stories about the followers of Jesus, even his betrayal, they did so in light of their own views and perspectives and theological investment. So today, the really important question is not why Judas betrayed Jesus, since our very earliest record gives no explicit motive, but what he betrayed. What did Judas betray? What exactly did he say when he went to the religious leaders? What exactly did he say that was so damning that brought Jesus to the cross? So it's not so much the question of motive, the what question, as to the question of, it's not so much the why question, the motive question, as to the question of the what. Okay. What exactly did he betray, if that's what he did? In other words, what sort of information did Judas give about Jesus that so incriminated him and led to the cross? The traditional view, of course, is that Judas revealed the truth of Jesus' kinship to the authorities, that Jesus thought of himself as the king. Another view within this traditional understanding is that Judas conveyed or communicated Jesus' vision and intentions to the religious leaders. But the view that is now widely shared among scholars today is that, in fact, Judas betrayed nothing. It was not a question of betrayal. Well, if it was betrayal, and then it's probably simply to do with Judas revealing the meeting place, the place where Jesus meets with his disciples. Rather, what Judas did was simply to hand over Jesus. And that phrase, as I said, is a very interesting phrase, and I'll come to that in a minute. Judith Liu, who is a New Testament scholar, a Methodist New Testament scholar, and who until recently was the Lady Margaret Professor of Divinity in Cambridge, and whom I had the pleasure of getting to know when I was a member in PINA. Judith was also a member, and in fact gave me most of the books that I've got behind me. Judas wrote the commentary in the Epworth commentary on Luke, and he had this insightful comment to offer. She says, what he did, what Judas did, what he agreed to do is unclear, although it might be to disclose where Jesus could be found alone. But the emphasis in the Greek is more that he handed him over than he betrayed him. Okay? We are very used to seeing what Judas did as an act of betrayal, and I have been using the word betrayal all along because it's very difficult to think of any other way of putting it than to put it that way. But in fact, the Greek word that the early Christians used to describe precisely what Judas did was not betrayal, but handed over. Paradoios or paradidomai. For those of you who are Greek enthusiasts, is the verb aorist active participle, masculine, singular nominative. Okay, the word is best translated to deliver or to hand over somebody. In the first century world, where the world is when the word is used, it had a sense of to give a city or a person into another's hand, especially as a hostage or an enemy. Okay, and what is really interesting is that we have no precedents in ancient literature where this Greek word paradidomai is translated as betrayal before the Gospels. Okay, so my suggestion is that the best way to translate the word we often translate as betrayal, paradoios or paradidomai, is to translate it as to deliver or to hand over someone or something. And it is for this reason that the traditional view of Judas as a betrayal has been challenged. And as I mentioned in the first part of our reflection, that some critical scholars today prefer to see Judas as an informer. And we know that this was a very common practice, a practice that was very common in Jesus' day in both Greek and Jewish literature. In other words, in Jesus' time, people who committed what Judas did were known as informers. Okay? And what is really striking here is that the Greek version of Isaiah 53, the Septuagint of Isaiah 53, the text which early Christians used to understand Jesus' death, uses this same Greek word, paradidos or paradidomai, that we find in the Gospel for Judas's act, appears 3 times in Isaiah 53. So Isaiah 53 verse 6 and verse 12. It's not always easy to see it in our English translation. So in my English translation from the NRSV, it says, all we like sheep have gone astray. We have all turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. So that's verse 6. And then verse 12 says, therefore I will allot him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out himself to death, and he was numbered with the transgressors, yet he bore the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors. So that is the English translation of the Septuagint, and it's not quite clear. But when you read the Septuagint, and this is my Septuagint, when you read it, you get the sense of being handed over much more strongly. So My Septuagint, in verse 6 of Isaiah 53, it read, "All we like sheep have gone astray, as a man has strayed in his own way. And here is it, and the Lord gave him over to our sins." Gave him over. Paradios is the word there. And then in verse 12, where the word appears twice, "Therefore he shall inherit many, and he shall divide the spoils of the strong." And here is the first one. "Because his sins, his soul was given over to death." Given over, paradios, to death. "And he was reckoned among the lawless, and he bore the sins of many. And because of their sins," and here is it, "he was given over." Paradios. So that's very interesting. And what is striking too is that when Paul was talking about the Last Supper, well, Paul actually doesn't even mention Judas in his letters. It'll be interesting to see if somebody can find it. I haven't seen it. He doesn't mention Judas in his letters. But when he was talking about the Last Supper, the Lord's Supper tradition, which he had received, he refers to the night when Jesus was handed over. And this is 1 Corinthians 11:23. When Jesus was handed over, Paul makes no mention about Judas as one who betrayed or even handed over Jesus to death. So what Judas did, whatever he did, the early Christians clearly did not see it as an act of betrayal, but rather as a part of God's plan. In the mysterious purposes of God, somehow Judas plays a part by handing over Jesus. And yet, what is interesting, again to note, and you get this sense in the Old Testament itself, in Isaiah 53 itself, that actually, in the ultimate sense, the only person who can do the handing over of the servant is God himself. It is God himself who does the handing over. And you get that sense also in Paul and in the New Testament. Where Paul is very emphatically clear that ultimately it was God himself who handed over Jesus, who delivered him up into the hands of evil men for our salvation. So when we finally come down to it, Judas, and indeed the whole Easter story, plunges us into deep mystery, leaving us with more questions than answers. Some have confidently often asserted that Judas's act means that he is consigned to eternal damnation. But for my part, I feel that to say this is to claim more than we can actually say or know, given the relatively short account of Judas in the Gospels. The Gospels don't really say a lot. They don't go into much detail about what Judas did. And in fact, as we have said, noted, they are very careful in attributing motive. Some Gospel writers do find motive, but our earliest Gospel, Mark, doesn't attribute motive. One thing we can know for sure, however, is that God's love And I know that sometimes God's love is often used, to stand for everything. And in some ways, it should. After all, love is God's character, is part of who God is. But one thing we can know for sure is that God's love and God's mercy is much, much bigger than any human sin and failure. Now, clearly, the gospel writers do not absolve Judas from what he did, but they do leave the matter ultimately into God's hand rather than to pronounce judgment. The most pressing challenge, in conclusion, which Judas gives us to all posterity, to give to all posterity, including us today, is the question of loyalty. It is the question of seeing ourselves honestly before God. As we resolve to follow Jesus in our walk and discipleship journey, how much are we prepared to stay faithful to Jesus' ideals and vision, however difficult and different it may be to our own personal agendas? Or are we like Judas, trying to force Jesus' hand to take the course we would rather prefer because they are easy and comfortable? Are we those ready to twist the demands of God's kingdom to fit our popular expectations and personal ideals and ambitions? That is the heart of it seems to me. Loyalty to Jesus regardless of the cost and the direction. And that means letting go of our personal agenda and embracing the agenda of Jesus. And that, of course, is what repentance means in the ultimate sense, not least the way in which the word is used in the first century world. And that is where Judas takes us, to the place of ultimate loyalty and allegiance in these final days of Jesus' ministry.